Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the gardens of a medieval courtyard, where moonlight pools like liquid silver over uneven stones, and the scent of crushed herbs hangs heavy in the air. You tread softly, cloak brushing against the dew-wet hedges, because in this world sound travels farther than you'd like and secrets are never quite safe. These gardens may look peaceful, rose bushes trimmed, fountains trickling, ivy climbing silently up walls, but make no mistake, they are stages. On them, noble men and women practice the delicate, dangerous art of love, using codes and rules that would tie your modern brain in knots. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least you'll look fabulous while trying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing how many corners of the world come together in this little night community. Now, dim the lights. Let quiet settle in, and ease yourself into the calm rhythm of tonight's story. You step onto the gravel path, each crunch sounding far louder than it should, and notice couples strolling under trellises. They look casual, but every gesture is rehearsed, every glance intentional. Lovers here don't say, "I like you," outright. They talk about hawks, about hunting, about how bright the morning star was at dawn. You think it sounds ridiculous, but for them it's survival. Words are a battlefield, and plain honesty is forbidden to reign. Mainstream historians tell us this was the essence of courtly love, a system of romance that grew in medieval courts of southern France before spreading across Europe. It thrived on the idea that love should be noble, restrained, and expressed in careful gestures rather than blunt desire. A lady wasn't told she had pretty hair, she was compared to dawn itself, or to the first flowers of spring. You roll your eyes, but secretly admit, it's a little more flattering than you up. Still, the stakes are deadly serious. One misplaced compliment could be seen as disrespect, or worse, as seduction. Historians still argue whether these rituals gave women more agency, since they often held the power to grant or deny favour, or whether it was just another cage, gilded and poetic, but still confining. As you lean against a stone fountain, you catch a pair of eyes meeting yours, darting away, then back again. The meaning is hidden, but clear enough. Here's the quirky tidbit. Nobles sometimes hired go-betweens, actual people whose job was to ferry messages or compliments between lovers. Imagine outsourcing your crush to an underpaid intern who has to memorize your best line of poetry and deliver it without messing up. It's the medieval equivalent of asking your friend to text your crush for you because you're too nervous. Not exactly smooth, but surprisingly common. You walk past a hedge trimmed into the shape of a lion. Behind it, hushed giggles erupt, followed by the scuffle of boots retreating quickly. A pair of squires vanishes into shadow, leaving the smell of cheap wine behind them. You realise that courtyards like this aren't quiet gardens at all. There are arenas of surveillance. Chaperones hover like hawks. A careless kiss or too bold gesture could cost someone their inheritance, their marriage prospects, or their reputation forever. The risk makes everything sharper, more electric. Rules of engagement dictate that passion must simmer, never boil. A lady leaning from her tower window at dawn, letting her silk sleeve brush the stone sill, that counts as encouragement. A knight riding past her balcony 3 times in a single day. That's persistence, not stalking apparently. You can't help but laugh, thinking maybe all this ceremony was just an excuse to get knights in better shape. And yet, beneath the stiff choreography, you sense the thrill. Courtiers hover by pillars, exchanging subtle signs. A laugh delivered too softly, a hand that lingers a breath too long, a phrase about springtime carrying more weight than whole speeches. Music drifts from a lute in the distance, and you realise the song itself might be a coded love letter, smuggling feeling into the air. Historians remind us that medieval castles offered little privacy. Even letters and poems could be intercepted, so lovers relied on layers of indirection. A glance across the hall might carry more meaning than an entire scroll of ink. To modern ears it sounds exhausting, but to them it was thrilling, a way to make every interaction pulse with possibility. You stand still for a moment, watching the performance unfold. Everything is theatre. Lovers, rivals, guardians. They're all actors on this stage, each role carefully scripted. You can't help but feel you're part of the show now, drawn into the tension of a dance that never quite resolves. The night air smells of roses and damp stone, the fountain's trickle echoing like a clock counting down. Somewhere in the shadows, a lover presses a token into another's hand. Somewhere else, a priest preaches restraint, ignored in the hush of passion. You realise the first secret rule of medieval love. Nothing is simple. Desire here must be dressed in layers of symbol and silence, every moment balanced between daring and discretion. You brush your fingers across the cool stone fountain, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on this space. Shadows stir, candles sputter, and you sense the story has only just begun. The courtyard isn't a destination, it's an invitation, and tonight you've accepted it. You leave the courtyard behind, the trickling fountain fading into silence, and find yourself drawn toward the cloistered arches of the castle. The air smells faintly of wax and damp stone, but there's something else too. A subtle clink, the rustle of fabric and the hushed gasp of a young squire scurrying past with something hidden under his cloak. When you step closer, you catch a glimpse of what he's carrying. Just a ribbon, nothing more. Yet in this world, that ribbon might weigh as much as a crown. Because here, in the labyrinth of medieval love, tokens and trinkets are the lifelines of romance. They are messages in tangible form, proof of affection, silent confessions safer than words. You can't just whisper "I love you" in front of everyone, not unless you enjoy being the centerpiece of gossip for the next feast. But you can slip a piece of fabric, a carved brooch, or a ring into someone's hand and let the object speak where language cannot. Mainstream historians point out that such objects were often charged with symbolic meaning. A lady's glove handed to a knight before a tournament wasn't just an accessory. It was a declaration. He would wear it tied to his helm or stitched to his sleeve, turning his entire performance on the jousting field into a love letter. If he triumphed, his victory was hers. If he fell, her token was stained with the price of his devotion. You start to imagine the awkwardness if she'd accidentally given him her least favourite glove. But not every trinket was glamorous. Locks of hair were common gifts, and while that sounds sweet, you can't ignore the fact that medieval hygiene wasn't exactly head and shoulders quality. Imagine sweating through armour on a summer afternoon with a tuft of hair tied to your chest. It's love, yes, but it's also the world's least practical fashion statement. You wonder how many knights developed rashes in the name of romance. You drift farther into the cloister, watching exchanges happen in corners. A flower drops, by accident, into a lap. A ring is placed discreetly on a serving platter hidden under bread rolls. Every object is charged with more than face value. Colours whisper promises, shapes carry riddles. A daisy might signal loyalty, rosemary might mean remembrance. But here's the problem. Historians still argue whether these meanings were universally understood. Did everyone know a daisy meant fidelity, or was that just a poet's invention? Was rosemary really a love charm, or simply kitchen seasoning that got dragged into symbolism? The uncertainty makes you smile. Giving a flower back then was like sending an emoji today. Half the time you're not even sure if the other person knows what you meant. And yet, when tokens worked, they were powerful. Picture a knight polishing his sword in some drafty outpost, pulling from his pocket a ribbon still faintly scented with lavender. In that moment, the ribbon isn't fabric. It's connection, survival, proof that someone is waiting for him beyond the battlefield. Or think of a lady trapped in endless lessons on etiquette, finding in her embroidery frame a tiny brooch tucked there by a daring messenger. For her, that trinket is not jewellery. It's freedom in miniature, a reminder that someone sees her as more than a pawn in family politics. Of course, tokens could also backfire in spectacular ways. There are stories of men gifting carved hearts, or even embroidered undergarments, only to be mocked for being too obvious. Imagine handing over what you think is the medieval equivalent of a romantic gesture, only to have it paraded at dinner for laughs. You wince in sympathy. It's basically the 12th century version of sending a risky text to the wrong group chat. The giving of tokens was also tied to loyalty in battle. Knights often pledged themselves to a lady by wearing her favour into tournaments. To win while displaying her ribbon was to bring her honour. To lose was to risk both reputations. This wasn't private flirting. It was public theatre, with reputations hanging on the outcome. You realise that in a way, medieval love tokens were like status updates, a way of declaring to the world not just who you were fighting for, but who defined you. The quirky side of all this is how elaborate the codes became. Some lovers embroidered hidden initials into handkerchiefs. Others carved tiny images into rings that only revealed their meaning if you tilted them in the light. The medieval world didn't invent subtlety, but it perfected it. Imagine unboxing a piece of jewellery today and realising it doubles as a coded diary entry. It's romance with a built-in puzzle. Yet, what fascinates you most is how fragile these tokens were. A ribbon could be lost, a flower could wilt, a ring could slip into a moat. Each object had to be guarded as carefully as a secret, because losing it meant losing proof of affection, and sometimes the loss itself became a scandal. One chronicle describes a knight finding another man wearing his lady's ribbon, a discovery that ended not in heartbreak, but in a duel. Suddenly, you understand how a scrap of fabric could ignite a feud. You pause under the arch of the cloister, the shadows deep and cool, and think about what these objects meant in a world of constant surveillance. They weren't just decorations, they were portable love letters, things you could hold close when words were too risky, and maybe, just maybe, the smallness of the tokens made them more powerful. A glance fades, a word can be denied, but a ribbon tied around your wrist, that's hard evidence. As the last light of the torches flickers against stone, you realise you've uncovered another rule. In the medieval game of love, affection had to be made visible without being spoken. Every trinket was both shield and weapon, both gift and gamble. And tonight, as you brush your hand across the cold wall of the cloister, you feel the weight of those tokens. The ribbons, the rings, the flowers, each carrying within it the silent heartbeat of a forbidden love. And somewhere, deeper in the castle, you sense the presence of watchful eyes. Chaperones waiting. Guardians who make sure that even the smallest token never goes unnoticed. You leave the cloister with its ribbons and flowers, stepping into the noise and warmth of the great hall. The moment you enter, the scale of the place hits you. High wooden beams stretching overhead like ribs of some vast beast. Torches spitting smoke. The smell of roasted boar, spiced wine, and rushes trampled underfoot. At first it looks like pure celebration. People laughing, goblets clinking, minstrels tuning up. But soon you notice something odd. No couple is ever really alone. Every glance is shadowed, every laugh overheard. Wherever a lady goes, a figure trails her steps, eyes sharp, ears sharper. You've just entered the world of medieval chaperones. Here, love has its spectators. Sisters, cousins, governesses, stewards, even older servants, all can serve as guardians of reputation. Their presence isn't incidental, it's required. Mainstream historians remind us that a young woman's honour was considered family property, tied directly to dynastic alliances and political futures. A single whispered rumour of impropriety could ruin not just her chances at a good match, but her family's standing. So what seems to you like a simple walk across the hall was, in their eyes, a high-stakes expedition that needed constant supervision. You find a seat near the trestle tables and watch how it plays out. A young knight leans in toward a lady, eager to whisper something daring, but before he can, her aunt clears her throat loudly enough to rattle the plates. He retreats, face red, while she pretends to examine her cup. You almost feel sorry for them, except it's so transparent you have to stifle a laugh. And yet, the presence of chaperones didn't kill romance. If anything, it forced creativity. Lovers became strategists, finding loopholes in the system. A knight might bow extra long, leaning just close enough to murmur a secret. A lady might accidentally drop her napkin, giving him a second to whisper as he retrieves it. The game wasn't in avoiding surveillance, it was in dancing just beneath its notice. The quirky tidbit. Some households even used animals as informal chaperones. Lapdogs and parrots, symbols of female virtue, often followed their mistresses everywhere. Small as they were, they had sharp eyes and sharper tongues. Well, in the parrot's case, literally. There are accounts of trained birds blurting phrases they'd overheard, sometimes blowing secrets wide open. Imagine risking everything for a whispered declaration, only to have a parrot repeat it at dinner. Medieval life, part romance, part sitcom. Historians still argue about the role of these guardians. Were they purely enforcers, or did some act as allies? Many tales hint that servants, maids, and even a few indulgent aunts sometimes looked the other way, sometimes for bribes, sometimes out of sympathy, sometimes because they enjoyed the drama. After all, even the sternest chaperone was still human, And humans love a good love story. You watch one maid clumsily knock over her embroidery basket, spilling spools everywhere, just as her mistress happens to pass by a young man. Her accident buys them a moment, but her smirk suggests it wasn't an accident at all. The hall shifts into dance, another chance for lovers to stretch the rules. Here, under the watchful eyes of family, men and women are permitted brief touches, carefully choreographed. Hands join, twirl, part again, innocent enough, yet charged with possibility. To the casual eye, it's just a circle dance. To those caught in the swirl, it's the only chance they'll get to hold each other, however briefly. You notice how a knight lingers a fraction longer on a handclasp, and the lady's blush is noticed by no one but you. Or maybe everyone notices and politely pretends not to. Of course, the rules had teeth. Chaperones weren't just obstacles, they were deterrents. A knight caught sneaking into a lady's chamber could face disgrace, exile, even mutilation. Women risked even more, shaming rituals, annulled marriages, ruined reputations. You imagine the anxiety of living in such a system where one slip could undo everything. And yet, the fact that people still risked it tells you how powerful the pull of desire was. The Great Hall, for all its laughter and noise, feels more like a theatre once you start paying attention. Everyone plays a part. The lady pretending not to notice her suitor, the aunt coughing strategically, the knight trying to slip his message through, all of it is scripted, rehearsed, expected. You feel almost like you're watching a play, except the stakes are real lives, real futures. And the tension makes every small success feel monumental. A whispered word under the cover of music, a letter slipped into a sleeve when the chaperone turns her head, a shared smile across the table. These aren't grand gestures, but in this world, they might as well be fireworks. As the torches gutter lower and servants begin clearing dishes, you realise the paradox of the chaperone. They were meant to keep lovers apart, to preserve virtue and honour, but in practice their watchfulness only heightened the thrill, forcing lovers to become bolder, cleverer, more inventive. Without the obstacle, perhaps desire would have been dull. With it, every touch and glance became an act of rebellion. You slip out of the hall, the echo of lute strings fading behind you, and step back into the cool air of the castle corridor. Ahead you hear another sound rising, softer but insistent, the strum of instruments and the rise of voices. Tonight, you're about to learn how music itself became the slyest messenger of all. The hall behind you still rings with laughter and the rustle of skirts, but now you follow the sound of softer strings and flutes. The passage opens into a long gallery lined with tapestries, and at its far end, musicians gather beneath painted rafters. Their lutes, harps, and fiddles gleam in the firelight, and as they begin to play, you feel the entire mood of the castle shift. Here, in this echoing corridor, you discover that music is not just entertainment, it is the sly messenger of love. You ease closer, taking in the scene. Courtiers cluster in small groups, their eyes half on the performers, half on one another. A knight leans casually against a pillar, but his posture betrays him. He listens not for the melody, but for a certain line, a certain refrain. The lady across the room lowers her gaze demurely, though the corners of her mouth twitch in a smile. A song isn't just a song here. It's a coded letter sung aloud, words carried on notes no one can accuse of impropriety. Mainstream historians tell us about the troubadours of southern France and northern Spain, poets and musicians who flourished between the 12th and 14th centuries. Their verses celebrated fin amour, or refined love, a blend of longing, restraint, and exaltation. Their songs praised ladies from afar, elevating them to near-divine figures, while the singer basked in devotion. To us it might sound overly dramatic, but for medieval audiences this was both art and instruction, shaping how people thought about romance. The quirky tidbit. Some troubadours were women, troubadours, who sang from their own perspective. Their verses sometimes flipped the script, voicing female desire, complaint, or even satire. Imagine a medieval open mic night where, between lofty odes to unattainable ladies, a witty countess takes the stage and belts out a cheeky ballad, roasting men who can't dance. You can almost hear the awkward coughs in the crowd. Historians still argue how much of this music reflected real-life practice. Were knights and ladies genuinely living by the ideals of these songs? Or was it mostly performance, fantasy projected into rhyme? Some evidence suggests noble courts modelled themselves after troubadour ideals, while others hint that the songs were a safe outlet for feelings that could never be acted upon. The debate continues, but as you stand here in the gallery, you sense that truth and performance blurred until no one could tell them apart. The music swells, and the lyrics drift over you. You notice how carefully they balance passion with restraint. A knight might sing of burning with desire, yet end his verse with a vow of chastity. The contradictions are deliberate, threading the needle between longing and morality. To the casual ear, it's poetry. To the intended listener, it's practically a confession. You watch as a lady hides her flushed cheeks behind her veil, the melody carrying words she cannot repeat aloud. There are lighter songs too, full of riddles and humour. A minstrel strums a jaunty tune about a shepherdess, and the audience laughs knowingly. The joke is clear. Love may be lofty, but it's also earthy, tangled with mishaps and misunderstandings. You chuckle, realising the medieval world had its own version of the pop song, catchy, cheeky, impossible to get out of your head. But music could be risky. A verse sung too boldly could expose a secret. A misplaced word might hint at an affair, sparking rumours that spread faster than fire in dry straw. You imagine the tension of hearing your name, or something dangerously close to it, woven into a ballad performed before an entire court. Suddenly everyone's ears perk up, and you're left wondering whether to blush, deny, or laugh it off. You notice how musicians themselves play the role of mediators. They are allowed access where others are barred, moving between courts, carrying songs like secret letters. A wandering troubadour might deliver more than entertainment. He might be the courier of coded affections, spreading whispers wrapped in rhyme. In this way, music became a network, stitching lovers across regions, letting emotions travel without a single incriminating line of ink. The gallery hums with these layers. On the surface, melody, rhythm, the joy of performance. Beneath, a conversation in code, invisible unless you know the key. You see it in the way listeners glance at each other when a certain verse lands, or the way a lady pretends to fan herself just as the refrain repeats. Every strum of the lute, every pause in the singing, might be part of a larger message. You let yourself sink into the rhythm, and it's almost hypnotic. The pluck of strings echoes against the stone, blending with the sighs of listeners. It strikes you that love here is never direct. It's always mediated by something else. Tokens, chaperones, music. Desire has to disguise itself in art, ritual, and performance, and maybe that very disguise is what makes it shimmer. As the song ends, the audience applauds lightly, their faces carefully neutral. But you've seen the glances, felt the undercurrent. The music has done its work. You step back into the corridor, the last notes echoing in your ears, carrying with you the understanding that sound itself was once a lover's ally. And ahead, beyond the gallery, waits another messenger of longing. Not songs, but ink and wax, folded and sealed, carried by trembling hands. The music fades behind you, leaving only the faint hum of strings still vibrating in the air. You follow a new sound now, quills scratching across parchment, the drip of melted wax falling onto folded paper, the shuffle of servants hurrying through narrow passages. You've entered the world of letters and poetry, where love is not sung in public but whispered onto pages, sealed and smuggled through corridors. You pass into a scriptorium-like chamber, its walls stacked with scrolls and scraps, the scent of ink so thick it makes your nose twitch. A clerk bends low over a desk, carefully copying lines of verse, while a nervous young man waits beside him, fingers twisting. You realise the clerk isn't working on scripture tonight. He's transcribing a love poem, meant for delivery under cover of darkness. In a society where every word could be overheard, writing gave lovers a private voice. Mainstream historians remind us that letter writing became a refined art in the later Middle Ages, especially among nobles and clerics. Treatises even circulated teaching the correct formulas for beginning, flattering and closing a love letter. You couldn't just scribble thinking of you and call it a day. No, you had to frame your longing in Latinized compliments, cite a few classical references, and maybe sneak in a line of scripture to make it sound pious. Imagine Shakespearean-level drama stuffed into a Hallmark card. Here's your quirky tidbit. Sometimes letters were written in invisible ink using milk or lemon juice, which only appeared when heated. You can't help but grin, realising the spycraft techniques of kids' secret notes had serious medieval roots. Picture a knight holding parchment over a candle just to read, "Your eyes shine like polished steel." It feels both absurd and brilliant. Historians still argue how often these letters were truly private. Many were dictated to scribes, since not everyone was literate, which meant a supposedly secret confession might pass through the ears of 2 or 3 servants before reaching its target. Privacy, it turns out, was always a luxury. Did this ruin the intimacy, or did the act of dictating itself add theatricality? Scholars can't agree, but you suspect it was both. Half confession, half performance. You watch as a servant ties a folded parchment with thread, then seals it with wax stamped by a ring. The emblem is both protection and risk. It proves the letter's origin, but also makes it incriminating if intercepted. You imagine the dread of seeing your seal broken, your private words read by eyes that were never meant to see them. The contents of these letters could range wildly. Some brimmed with soaring poetry, knights comparing their ladies to stars, to saints, to unattainable goddesses. Others were more practical, arranging meetings, plotting alliances of heart and body. And some, you can't help but think, must have been little more than doodles and longing sighs. Not every knight had the soul of a poet. Some probably struggled to rhyme love with dove and called it a masterpiece. Poetry itself was another battlefield. Troubadours might compose verses for patrons that doubled as love letters in disguise. To the audience, it was art. To the intended recipient, it was intimacy smuggled in plain sight. You smile at the cleverness, singing your feelings to the entire court while making it look like innocent entertainment. It's the medieval version of subtweeting. Everyone hears it, but only one person knows it's about them. Of course, the risks were enormous. A discovered letter could trigger scandal, duels, even annulments. There are stories of lords confronting rivals after intercepting poems, of ladies accused of impropriety because a folded parchment fell from their sleeve. One wrong word on paper could set entire families at odds. You imagine the tension of writing by candlelight, trying to balance sincerity with caution, passion with prudence. And yet, the very act of writing made love tangible. A letter could be hidden in a chest, pressed under a pillow, carried into exile. Unlike a fleeting glance or whispered word, it endured. You picture a lady smoothing the folds of parchment, reading the lines until the ink smudges, drawing courage from the permanence of those words. You step closer to the table, running your fingers across a scrap of discarded parchment. The ink stains your skin, and you realise you're holding the residue of someone's secret. How many of these scraps once carried confessions, now lost to time? How many poems crumbled in hands too nervous to keep them? In this room, surrounded by ink and wax, you feel the heartbeat of another rule. Love in the Middle Ages was never silent. If it could not be spoken, it was written. If it could not be written, it was sung. And if neither, it was stitched into fabric or hidden in flowers. Always it found a way. The clerk blows on a finished letter, the wax still glistening, before handing it to a page boy who slips it under his cloak. You watch the boy vanish down a dark stair, carrying with him the weight of another person's longing. And you sense that where letters and poetry ended, another code began, stitched not into parchment but into fabric and symbols. The stairwell you climb now is narrow, its stones damp from centuries of footsteps, but at the top the air changes. Instead of the ink and wax of the scriptorium, you smell dried herbs, wool, and faint traces of perfume. You've wandered into a chamber filled with fabric, hoops of embroidery, baskets of flowers, and racks of colourful gowns. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than the domestic heart of the castle, ladies' work, quiet and unassuming. But you soon realise you're standing in a codebook written not in words but in colours, patterns, and blossoms. Welcome to the secret language of symbols. You pause to watch a woman bend over her embroidery frame, her needle darting in and out of the fabric with quick precision. At the border of her gown she stitches flowers, violets, roses, lilies, seemingly decorative, but you know better. Mainstream historians note that in medieval Europe, clothing and decoration served as deliberate signals of emotion, affiliation, even availability. To embroider a violet wasn't just craft, it was a subtle announcement of modesty. To wear green might whisper of hope or, in some regions, of lust. A single misplaced colour could change the meaning of an entire outfit. The quirky tidbit. Some lovers even ate their symbols. Flowers weren't just pinned or stitched, they were candied, steeped, brewed. A knight might present candied violets to his beloved, or a woman might sip marigold tea as part of a romantic ritual. Sweet gestures, sure, but risky too. Mix the wrong herb and your flirtation could double as a laxative. You grin, realizing medieval love potions often towed the line between dessert and disaster. Historians still argue how widespread this symbolic language really was. Did everyone in the court instantly recognize that rosemary meant remembrance, or were these associations confined to certain literary circles? Some evidence suggests variation by region. What whispered devotion in France might mean something entirely different in England or Spain. The uncertainty itself added tension. Imagine handing someone a daisy to signal loyalty, only for them to take it as a brush-off. Miscommunication wasn't just awkward, it could be catastrophic. You drift past a rack of gowns, brushing your hand over the fabrics. Each colour seems to pulse with meaning. Scarlet velvet radiates passion, while pale linen speaks of innocence. A lady adjusting her headpiece at the window seems to you like she's fussing. But to her beloved watching from the courtyard, that gesture might be an invitation, a promise, or even a warning. Suddenly the castle feels alive with unspoken messages, a place where everyone is talking without moving their lips. Jewellery carried its own codes. A brooch shaped like a bird could signal freedom. A ring engraved with initials might hide a message only one person could read. Even the way a cloak was fastened could be significant. You imagine a knight striding into the hall, cloak clasped to one side, the gesture subtle but unmistakable to the woman who knows the code. It's less fashion statement, more encrypted telegram. You pause to watch as a young maid arranges dried herbs into a pouch. Lavender, sage, thyme, each chosen not just for scent but for symbolism. Rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, basil for fidelity. A knight carrying such a sachet into battle wasn't just wearing protection against evil spirits, he was literally carrying his lover's heart stitched in herbs. You picture him drawing strength from the fragrance mid-charge, more buoyed by memory than by armour. The risk of misstep was always present. One chronicler tells of a nobleman interpreting a garland of daisies as a love confession, only to realise later it was just seasonal decoration. The embarrassment must have been brutal, like thinking someone's friendly wave meant a marriage proposal. You can't help but laugh at the thought. Medieval mixed signals, proof that humans have always been terrible at decoding crushes. But beneath the humour, you feel the intensity. For people who couldn't speak openly, who lived under constant watch, these tiny details were lifelines. A stitch, a flower, a clasp. Each could carry the weight of 1,000 unsent letters. The whole castle becomes a buzzing network of signs, each hallway a sentence, each garment a poem. You move closer to one of the tapestries, tracing the raised threads. To an outsider, it's a hunting scene, knights on horseback, dogs chasing stags. But then you notice the border. Stitched into the corner, almost invisible, is a single tulip. Why? You realise it's less artwork, more diary entry. A lady could spend months embroidering her longing into a picture, her secret hidden in plain sight. Only her beloved would know what to look for. It's as if her chamber wall itself has become a page of love letters, but written in thread instead of ink. And this realization hits you. Symbols weren't just convenient, they were thrilling. To wear a flower in your hair, to send a sprig of rosemary, to stitch a hidden bloom into your sleeve, these were acts of daring, coded rebellions against silence. Each gesture was small, but the stakes were enormous. You linger a moment longer, the scent of herbs clinging to your cloak, and realize you're starting to see the world as they did. Alive with signs, vibrating with double meanings. You're becoming fluent in a language no one teaches, only practices. And as you step back into the corridor, you know where this fluency will lead you next. Into the carefully choreographed dances of the Great Hall, where touch itself becomes another secret code. The corridor opens again into the Great Hall, but this time it looks different. The trestle tables are pushed to the walls, torches burn brighter, and musicians gather in the corner with fiddles and drums. The rushes on the floor have been freshly scattered, and the space hums with anticipation. Tonight is for dancing, not the kind you know, sweaty and chaotic, but a ritualized, rule-bound choreography where every step, every brush of a hand carries meaning. You've stepped into the coded world of medieval dance where touch is permitted but only under the sharpest restrictions. You slip into the shadows to observe. Lines form, men on one side, women on the other. A fiddler strikes a low note, and slowly, with studied elegance, they begin to move. The music is steady, deliberate, and so are the dancers. They advance, retreat, circle, join hands for the briefest of instants before separating again. To modern eyes, it looks stiff, maybe even awkward. But to those inside it, this is electricity disguised as etiquette. Mainstream historians explain that dances like the carol and bass dance gave unmarried men and women rare opportunities for physical contact. In a world where even a glance across a corridor could spark gossip, here was a sanctioned setting to clasp hands, even if only for a heartbeat. Imagine craving a touch so badly that the highlight of your week is an official group dance. For us it feels quaint. For them, it was dynamite wrapped in lace. The quirky tidbit? There were actual manuals that described how to hold hands properly during a dance. Too firm, and you looked crude. Too limp, and you seemed disinterested. Some instructions even detailed the correct placement of the thumb. It's essentially the medieval version of how to shake hands without being weird. You can't help but grin at the thought of a knight sweating more over finger placement than over jousting technique. Historians still argue whether these dances were truly intimate, or if the ever-watchful audience smothered any spark. Some believe couples found ways to sneak signals into the steps, an extra squeeze of the hand, a deliberate stumble that allowed for a fleeting touch. Others suggest the pressure of scrutiny left everyone too stiff with nerves to enjoy themselves. Watching the dancers now, you suspect both are true. Some look flushed, alive with secret meaning. Others stare grimly at their feet, praying not to step on anyone's hem. You notice how much the rules heighten every detail. A hand brushed across a palm feels like a thunderclap. A wrist caught mid-turn lingers for a second too long, and the lady's breath quickens. To us, it's invisible. To them, it's a firework display. You realise that restraint magnifies passion, turning the smallest gestures into monumental ones. And then there's the spectacle. These dances weren't just for the lovers, they were for the whole court. Parents, rivals and suitors all watched from the benches, reading signals, judging suitability, whispering commentary. A stumble might mean clumsiness. A bold glance might signal audacity. Every step was public audition, both for love and for social reputation. It's part romance, part job interview, with music playing to soften the edges. You watch as the dance changes tempo. Now partners circle, hands almost, but not quite, touching. The tension is unbearable. A lady lets her fingers hover so close to her partner's sleeve that the fabric trembles from her breath. He, in turn, bows too low, lingering just long enough that the room pretends not to notice. This is the art. Push the boundary just enough to thrill, never enough to condemn. Of course, accidents happened. A misplaced step, a crushed toe, a trip on uneven rushes. You imagine the horror of tumbling into your partner and hearing the crowd's gasp. Was it clumsiness, or was it boldness disguised as clumsiness? In this world, even falling down had layers of interpretation. You chuckle, realising that medieval dances were not immune to the same awkward disasters that plague school dances centuries later. Still, for all its rules, the dance gave lovers something priceless, plausible deniability. If caught smiling too brightly, if accused of lingering too long, they could simply point to the music and say, "It was the step, not me." That deniability made the entire hall a theatre of possibility, where anything might be true, or might not. The music slows, partners bow, separate, and retreat to their respective sides. The moment ends, but the glances linger. You catch one lady pressing her palm to her chest as though the heat of the hand she touched still lingers there. Across the hall, the knight straightens his cloak with unnecessary force, trying not to grin. Nothing has been spoken, but everything has been said. You exhale, realising you've witnessed another rule etched into medieval love. Passion thrives under restriction. The very fences meant to contain it only make it burn brighter. You step away from the hall, the echo of fiddles fading, and wonder what happens when those fences fall away completely. and as you turn down the next corridor, you hear laughter. Not refined and cautious, but wild, muffled, disguised. Ahead lies a masquerade where masks hide faces, and the rules of touch dissolve into chaos. The laughter grows louder as you approach a pair of double doors. Unlike the heavy oak portals of the Great Hall, these are lighter, painted with gilded vines and bright birds. When you push them open, the atmosphere changes instantly. The torches burn brighter, coloured fabrics drape from the rafters, and masked figures swirl across the floor in a riot of velvet, feathers, and polished wood. You've entered the world of the masquerade, where for a few hours the rules of identity dissolve, and desire hides behind painted faces. The first thing that strikes you is how surreal it looks. A woman with a fox's snout mask leans close to a man whose face is hidden behind a gilded lion. A figure in a hood shaped like a bird of prey bows extravagantly to someone draped in silver bells. Laughter rings out louder than you've heard elsewhere in the castle. Not restrained giggles, but full-throated, playful, almost reckless. Already you feel that this is a place where boundaries blur. Mainstream historians tell us that masks and disguisings became popular in the later Middle Ages and flourished into the Renaissance. They weren't just entertainment, they were tools for loosening social order. Under a mask, a noble could flirt with someone beneath their rank, a rival could whisper what he dared not say in daylight, and even a married lady might enjoy a few hours of playful anonymity. The mask promised freedom, or at least the illusion of it. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some masks weren't only decorative. A few had small sponges or herbs tucked inside, meant to protect the wearer from disease or foul smells. In plague-ridden cities, that was practical. But imagine trying to flirt through a beaked mask stuffed with rosemary and vinegar. Nothing says romance like muffled conversation and the faint scent of salad dressing. Historians still argue how much freedom these masks actually provided. Were they genuine escapes from hierarchy, or carefully staged performances where everyone knew exactly who was who beneath the disguises? Some sources suggest nobles used them for daring escapades, while others claim the whole thing was an elaborate joke, more theatre than rebellion. The truth probably lies in the middle. Masks offered space for risk, but everyone knew the risks had limits. You wander through the crowd, the floor alive with music and movement. Here, unlike the solemn dances of the Great Hall, the steps are wilder. Partners change frequently, hands linger longer, laughter covers slips. A masked woman touches your arm briefly, her gloved fingers trailing just enough to make your pulse jump, then vanishes into the crowd. Was it accident or intention? You'll never know. That uncertainty is the heart of the masquerade. You notice how masks turn every interaction into a riddle. Two people lean close, whispering urgently, and you wonder if they are true lovers or bitter enemies using the disguise for secrecy. A knight bows extravagantly to a masked lady, but the way she tilts her head makes you suspect she knows exactly who he is. The beauty of the masquerade lies in this ambiguity. Everything is both possible and deniable. The games go further still. Some masks included riddles, short plays, even improvised debates about love. Couples might trade witty lines, testing each other's intelligence as much as their charm. Imagine trying to flirt while also solving a riddle about falconry, half romance, half trivia night. It sounds absurd, but in a world where intelligence and wit were prized as much as beauty, these verbal duels were intoxicating. Of course, danger lurked behind the masks. A careless word spoken to the wrong disguised figure could spell disaster once identities were revealed. Picture a knight pouring his heart out to a lady in silver, believing her to be his beloved, only to discover it was her cousin, or worse, her mother-in-law. The horror is almost comical, unless you're the one caught in the mix. You also notice how masks gave space for critique. Nobles could mock leaders or imitate rivals in exaggerated costume, saying things in jest they'd never dare otherwise. It was risky satire disguised as play, and if the humour cut too deep, well, the mask could be removed, and the consequences could be harsh. Masquerades balanced constantly between freedom and punishment, joy and danger. Yet, for all its risks, the masquerade thrived because it allowed people to taste a world without rigid boundaries. For a few hours, servants might jest with lords, women might lead dances with men, rivals might laugh together. Desire, usually so hemmed in by tokens and chaperones, could finally breathe. You pause by the wall, watching the crowd ripple with colour. A masked figure slips a folded parchment into your hand before disappearing again. You unfold it, but the writing inside is too vague to reveal much. Is it a declaration? A joke? A mistake? You're left holding uncertainty itself, the very essence of this night. As the music swells and laughter rises, you realise that the masquerade doesn't erase rules, it suspends them just enough to make breaking them feel safe. And in that suspension, people reveal more than they mean to. Eventually you slip out through the doors again, leaving behind the whirl of masks and feathers. The air outside feels colder, the castle darker, quieter. Yet you know what comes next will be even more intimate. For beyond disguises lies the chamber where curtains are drawn and voices drop low, where words spoken in bed carry the weight of kingdoms. The masquerade's laughter fades behind you as you climb another stairwell, this one spiralling upward into the castle's private chambers. The noise of the feast grows faint, replaced by the creak of wood beneath your boots and the faint echo of your own breathing. Up here, away from the torches and the crowded hall, the air feels different. Thicker, quieter, charged. You push open a door and step into a chamber lit by a single candle. Heavy curtains drawn across the bed swallow most of the light, but you can hear whispers and soft laughter within. You've stumbled into one of the most mysterious realms of medieval love, the bedroom rituals where intimacy collided with etiquette, religion and politics, and where even behind closed doors, nothing was truly simple. The first thing you notice is how little privacy truly existed. Contrary to the image of lovers alone in a chamber, many noble bedrooms doubled as semi-public spaces. Servants carried in food, friends lingered in conversation, and in some royal courts, entire entourages slept in the same room. A noble couple's bed might be surrounded by attendants, making private intimacy more like a performance with an audience politely pretending not to look. Mainstream historians point out that consummating royal marriages was sometimes witnessed, yes, witnessed, by courtiers to guarantee legitimacy. You shudder, imagining the awkwardness. Nothing says romance like your in-laws peeking from the corner. The quirky tidbit: some newlyweds were blessed with bizarre charms to encourage fertility. One recorded ritual involved slipping a roasted dove under the marriage bed, supposedly to inspire passion. You can't help but smirk. The dove surely had other thoughts about this arrangement. Historians still argue how much these rituals reflected real practice versus exaggerated chronicles. Did couples truly follow elaborate prescriptions, or did scribes embellish tales for entertainment or moral instruction? Some scholars suggest the most dramatic accounts were cautionary tales, propaganda meant to shape behaviour. Others insist they capture kernels of truth about how medieval people navigated the line between duty and desire. You lean against the wall and watch the chamber. The heavy curtains around the bed aren't just for warmth. They create a symbolic space, a stage where marriage is acted out. The woman sits in her shift, hair unbound, while the man removes his tunic with deliberate formality. They speak in hushed tones, not just because of nearby servants, but because the moment itself feels fragile. In this world, even behind curtains, you can't fully escape rules. Intimacy here isn't only physical. Words themselves matter. Couples exchanged whispered vows, prayers, or recited blessings. Some invoked saints to protect their union. Others wove poetry into their courtship even in bed. Imagine lying beside someone and quoting a troubadour's verse with all the gravitas of scripture. It sounds corny, but it was deadly serious. The bed was both sanctuary and stage, charged with emotion, politics, and symbolism. The furniture tells its own story. Beds were enormous, draped with rich fabrics, elevated on platforms, almost like thrones. They were symbols of power as much as comfort. To be invited into someone's bed wasn't just intimacy, it was prestige. The sheets themselves were often embroidered with family crests or religious images, reminders that even here, under the covers, lineage and faith hovered close. You chuckle at the thought of rolling over only to see a saint's solemn face stitched into the pillowcase. You can't ignore the way ritual shaped the rhythm of these nights. In some regions, couples followed detailed calendars, avoiding intimacy on feast days or during Lent. That left fewer nights open, making each encounter less casual, more significant. Imagine needing both passion and a liturgical calendar to coordinate your love life. Romance meets scheduling nightmare. Still, for all the rules, there was rebellion. Lovers carved out secret rituals of their own, private jokes, coded phrases, tokens hidden in the bedding. In a world of endless performance, these small rebellions mattered most. You picture a woman tucking a flower under her husband's pillow, or a man whispering a joke only she would understand. Tiny rebellions, perhaps, but they transformed duty into something closer to choice, and yet danger was always present. An intercepted token, a discovered tryst, even a rumour could bring ruin. In noble households, bedroom politics weren't just about love, they were about succession. A child conceived here might inherit land, titles, even crowns, which is why so many eyes lingered near the curtains, why whispers of betrayal carried such deadly weight. You realise that for all its softness, the bed was one of the most dangerous places in the castle. You step back, listening to the rhythm of voices softening within the curtains. The candle burns low, its light flickering across carved wood. You think of how many centuries of passion, fear, joy, and pressure these walls have seen. How many whispered secrets evaporated into the air, leaving only faint echoes for you to imagine. In this quiet, you understand another rule. Medieval intimacy was never simply personal. It was layered with duty, ritual, surveillance, and symbolism. Even the most private moments bore the weight of family, faith, and politics. But that weight made each gesture of tenderness, each shared laugh, each whispered line of poetry, even more precious. The candle sputters. You step into the hall again, leaving the chamber to its shadows. Ahead, the cold stone leads you toward another sound. Not whispers of lovers, but murmured prayers and the faint clink of rosaries. For in this world, love could never exist apart from religion. The church was always waiting just around the corner. The staircase narrows again, curling downward into a passage where the air is cool and smells faintly of incense. You follow the sound of murmured prayers, the rhythmic clink of rosary beads sliding through fingers, and the distant chanting of monks in a chapel somewhere deeper in the castle complex. If the great hall was filled with laughter and the bedchamber pulsed with whispers, here the tone is different, sombre, reverent, watchful. Because in the Middle Ages, love and desire didn't simply unfold between two people. The church stood always nearby, sometimes blessing, often judging, and never silent. You step into a small side chapel, its stone walls damp with candle soot. A crucifix looms above the altar, its figure of Christ stern in the flickering light. Kneeling before it, a woman prays, lips moving silently while a man lingers in the shadows, waiting for her glance. Even here, under the gaze of saints, the dance of courtship continues, but now it must pass through the filters of sin, confession, and ritual. Mainstream historians remind us that the medieval church shaped nearly every aspect of love, marriage, and intimacy. Marriage itself was considered a sacrament, as holy as baptism or communion. That meant unions were not simply contracts between families, but binding spiritual covenants. Priests presided not only at altars but over bedrooms, their voices echoing in laws that dictated when, how, and with whom intimacy could occur. The quirky tidbit. Some sermons included shockingly detailed instructions for avoiding sin in bed. Preachers could warn couples against positions deemed improper, or forbid intimacy on holy days, which, if you add them up, left far fewer nights available than you'd think. Imagine your parish priest as both marriage counsellor and hall monitor, tracking whether your Tuesday evening counted as liturgically appropriate for romance. It's both absurd and terrifying. Historians still argue how seriously couples took these endless rules. Did people truly follow church calendars, abstaining on saints' days, fasting seasons and Fridays? Or did they nod piously in church, then wink and carry on behind closed doors? Evidence suggests a mix. Some devout households followed the letter of the law, while others treated it more as holy suggestion. Scholars still debate how rigidly faith shaped private behaviour, but what's certain is that the church was always part of the conversation, even in bed. You notice how confession shaped the atmosphere. Couples might unburden themselves of sins of the flesh to priests, transforming private intimacy into public penitence. Imagine whispering your bedroom secrets into the ear of a confessor waiting for absolution. It blurred the line between private desire and communal morality, making love not just personal, but a matter of spiritual record. At the same time, religion could sanctify love. Prayers for fertility, blessings for children, rituals before weddings, these infused intimacy with sacred weight. The bed itself could be sprinkled with holy water, the sheets blessed by clergy, the act framed as holy duty rather than lust. For couples navigating both genuine passion and political expectation, this gave their union a divine stamp of legitimacy. Love was not only theirs, it was in theory God's work. You pause to watch the woman in the chapel rise from her knees. She crosses herself, then drops a sprig of rosemary onto the altar. The gesture is symbolic, remembrance, devotion, but also a prayer that her affection will not be condemned as sin. Her lover steps closer, not daring to touch her, but their eyes meet long enough to communicate what no words here could safely carry. You sense the weight of that glance, its desire reframed as prayer, longing channeled through piety. Still, danger lurked in every shadow. Adultery, fornication, and secret unions could bring harsh punishments, not only from family but from church courts. Penances might include fasting, pilgrimages, or even public shaming. A tryst in the wrong place could spiral into decades of repentance. You imagine how many whispered confessions began with, "Forgive me, Father, for I lingered too long." And yet devotion and desire sometimes intertwined beautifully. Mystics wrote of divine love in language indistinguishable from passion. Saints described their union with God in terms that sound startlingly romantic, even erotic. This overlap created space for lovers to veil their feelings in spiritual terms. To call someone an angel, a vision, a saviour. These weren't just metaphors, but coded language, sheltering desire under the cloak of faith. The chapel grows quieter, the candlelight dimming as the prayers end. You realise that in this world, love never belonged solely to lovers. It was always framed by something larger, duty, ritual, or here, the church. Whether blessing or condemning, religion shaped the rhythm of longing, laying heavy hands on even the most private moments. You step back into the corridor, the scent of incense clinging to your cloak. Behind you, the crucifix fades into shadow. Ahead you hear new sounds rising, sharper this time. Not the low murmur of prayers, but the heated clash of voices, the arguments of philosophers and clerks trying to wrestle love into categories. For beyond religion lies another battlefield, the world of debate, where scholars argued endlessly about what love really was and whether it was ever worth the trouble. The corridor opens into a vaulted chamber lined with shelves of parchment rolls and ink-stained desks. Candles flicker in iron sconces, illuminating faces bent over manuscripts. Here, the air smells of beeswax, ink and dust. But it's charged with another kind of energy. Not the hushed passion of a chapel, nor the playful daring of a masquerade, but the sharp tension of argument. This is the space where love itself becomes theory, where scholars, clerics, and poets sharpen their quills to wrestle with questions that lovers have no time to ask. You've stepped into the scholarly debate, a battlefield where desire is dissected like a frog in a lecture hall. You pause near a desk where a monk furrows his brow over a massive tome. He mutters Latin phrases under his breath, quill scratching furiously. Across the room, a younger scholar waves his parchment like a sword, reading aloud a passage from Ovid's Ars Amatoria, while others groan and shake their heads. The room buzzes with words like virtues, concupiscentia, amor curialis, virtue, desire, courtly love. If the hall was a stage and the chapel an altar, this place is a debating arena, and the prize is nothing less than defining what love really means. Mainstream historians remind us that medieval universities and clerical circles debated love as part of both theology and philosophy. Was love ennobling, lifting souls toward virtue, or was it dangerous, a distraction from faith and reason? Thinkers like Andreas Capellanus, author of De Amor, The Art of Courtly Love, tried to codify the rules of romance into something like a manual, outlining who could love whom, how they should behave, and what rewards or punishments awaited. The fact that someone wrote a textbook on flirting tells you how seriously the subject was taken. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some debates were staged almost like courtroom dramas, complete with mock trials where love itself was put in the dock. Poets would defend it, priests would prosecute it, and audiences would cheer for their side. Imagine a medieval version of a debate club where the resolution is true love exists, and everyone argues with a goblet of wine in hand. You picture some poor clerk trying to cite Aristotle, while a troubadour interrupts with a bawdy rhyme, and suddenly the seriousness feels almost comedic. Historians still argue how much of these debates reflected reality. Were they just intellectual games for educated elites? Or did they actually shape how people courted and married? Some suggest the elaborate rules of courtly love filtered into noble households because scholars and poets put them into circulation. Others think the whole system was more of a literary invention, with ordinary people carrying on their romances in much simpler, messier ways. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in between. You move through the chamber, eavesdropping on the arguments. One monk insists that love outside marriage is inherently sinful, a gateway to ruin. Another counters that love can inspire knights to noble deeds, even self-sacrifice. A poet nearby chimes in with a sonnet, claiming that without love there is no art. The clash of voices is almost musical, logic, faith, and creativity crashing together like cymbals. The stakes weren't merely academic. These debates shaped sermons, informed laws, and trickled into popular culture. When a priest thundered against lust from the pulpit, he was echoing arguments refined in rooms like this. When a knight read poetry to his lady, he was playing out ideals first argued in scholastic texts. Love was everywhere, but it was never free. It was always reframed, redefined, claimed by one authority or another. You notice how the arguments sometimes border on absurd. One clerk insists that true love cannot exist between husband and wife, because marriage is about duty, not desire. Another claims that only noble men and noble women are capable of love at all, since peasants lack refinement. You shake your head, knowing full well that love cares nothing for rank or theory. It's a reminder that scholars, for all their ink and parchment, often misunderstood the messy truth lived by the people outside their libraries. Still, you can't deny the passion in their words. Even when they condemn desire, their language is heated, their faces flushed. It's as if the very act of arguing about love stirs the same emotions they claim to analyse. You wonder how many of these monks and clerks secretly cherished their own tokens, wrote their own hidden letters, or whispered their own prayers of longing. At one desk you find a manuscript half-finished. The scribe has written, "Amores dulcis dolor," love is a sweet pain. The ink smudges at the end, as if he stopped mid-thought, perhaps carried away by the memory of someone real. The phrase lingers with you. Sweet pain, the paradox at the heart of all this theory, both condemned and celebrated, dissected yet never truly explained. The chamber grows quieter as the scholars tire, their voices falling into murmurs. Quills scratch slower, candles gutter lower. You slip out into the hall again, ears still ringing with arguments. And you realise that in this world love was never only personal, it was always public, subject to scrutiny, defined by others. But no matter how many quills scribbled or tongues wagged, the lovers themselves carried on, inventing new ways to bend rules and challenge definitions. Ahead, you hear the heavy clank of armour and the creak of a portcullis. The sound is harsher than the debates, more primal. For now, you leave behind the scholars and their parchment to step into the courtyard of knights, where tournaments turn desire into spectacle, and devotion is proved not in words but in bruises. The air changes as you step into the open courtyard again. The quiet murmur of scholars arguing fades, replaced by the metallic clink of armour, the neigh of restless horses, and the roar of a crowd gathering along wooden stands. Torches blaze to life as squires tighten straps and knights lower their visors. You're no longer in the realm of parchment and debate. You're in the raw theatre of the tournament, where love and loyalty are proved not by poems but by bruises and broken lances. The field glitters with banners, each marked with colours and crests. You notice ribbons tied to helmets, scarves wrapped around arms. These aren't mere decorations. They're the favours of ladies, gifts of cloth that transform combat into performance. A knight who fights bearing his beloved's token isn't just jousting for glory. He's declaring devotion in the most public way imaginable. One glance at a crimson scarf streaming from a helm, and you understand that this tournament is as much about courtship as it is about martial skill. Mainstream historians remind us that jousts and melees were deeply tied to the culture of courtly love. Knights pledged themselves to ladies, and their victories on the field brought honour to both. Tournaments became stages where romance and violence intertwined, where the pageantry of love masked the brutal crack of lance against shield. For the watching crowds, this was spectacle. For the lovers involved, it was proof. Here's your quirky tidbit. Sometimes knights wore elaborate disguises in tournaments, riding as the Knight of the Swan or the Knight of the Blue Griffin. These alter egos allowed them to fight anonymously, or more often, to make their courtship more dramatic. Imagine a knight lumbering around in full armour with swan feathers glued to his helm, trying to look mysterious while sweating buckets. Not exactly subtle, but definitely memorable. Historians still argue whether these tournaments were genuinely romantic or mostly political theatre. Were knights truly fighting for love, or was the language of devotion just a convenient mask for ambition, rivalry, and the pursuit of wealth? Some chronicles describe knights dedicating victories to ladies with great flourish, while others suggest most of them were more focused on prize money than poetry. As usual, the line between sincerity and performance is blurred. You watch as the herald calls the first bout. Two armoured figures lower their lances, spurring their horses forward. The impact is thunderous, wood splintering, armour ringing. The crowd roars, but your eye goes to the lady in the stands clutching her veil, her gaze fixed on one knight. His scarf, her scarf, streams in the wind. In this instant, the violence transforms into something intimate, each blow a coded love letter written in dust and sweat. But tournaments were not only jousts. The day often ended with padam, ritualised combats where knights defended symbolic objects, like a lady's glove tied to a tree. Opponents challenged them, not just for honour, but to steal the token. To lose such a contest meant humiliation, both for the knight and for the lady who bestowed the favour. You imagine the tension of sitting in the stands, knowing your reputation rides on whether your champion stays in the saddle. You also notice how tournaments blurred the line between public and private. A glance exchanged between knight and lady before a charge, a bow after a victory, the gesture of presenting a broken lance. All these were public signals, yet everyone pretended not to see too much. It was romance under floodlights, and everyone played along. The risks, of course, were deadly real. Knights broke bones, lost eyes, even died on the field. A token tied to a helm could come back bloodstained, or not at all. Yet this danger only heightened the drama. To dedicate your life and body in such a way was the ultimate romantic gesture, equal parts devotion and recklessness. You can't help but think of it as medieval extreme sports, but with more lace. You wander among the squires after the joust, hearing their gossip. They whisper about knights who boast too loudly of their ladies, about scandals sparked by misplaced favours, about rivalries that spill off the field. For every triumphant gesture, there are whispers of jealousy, bitterness, and betrayal. Love in the tournament ground is never simple. It's always entwined with competition and pride. As the sun sets, the field empties. Broken lances lie scattered, ribbons flutter in the dust, and exhausted knights limp away. The ladies withdraw, veils drawn, their expressions unreadable. You sense that what just played out wasn't only about combat or even about love. It was about reputation, power, and the ways people used romance as a kind of currency, staking their futures on the outcomes of bruising games. You step back into the castle, ears still ringing with the roar of the crowd, and ahead you hear a softer sound again, the murmur of servants, the shuffle of footsteps in hidden corridors. Because not all courtship was fought in public tournaments. Some unfolded in shadowed corners, carried by the voices of those who saw everything and said nothing, unless it suited them. The castle feels quieter after the thunder of the tournament field. You leave behind the smell of dust and horse sweat, following instead the hushed shuffle of slippers across stone. Servants drift like shadows, maids carrying folded linens, pages fetching water, stewards balancing ledgers. At first glance they seem invisible, mere background to the drama of knights and ladies, but stay long enough and you realise something startling. In a world where chaperones guard, poets sing and priests condemn, it is the servants who truly know everything. Welcome to the secretive realm of servant gossip and clandestine encounters. You pause in a narrow corridor as two laundresses bend over a basket, whispering with barely contained laughter. One mimics a knight's pompous bow, while the other covers her mouth, eyes darting to make sure no one overhears. They're not just exchanging jokes, they're recounting secrets, information gleaned from chamber pots, laundry stains, and overheard whispers. Mainstream historians remind us that servants were the silent record keepers of medieval courts. They saw who entered which chamber, who lingered too long in the garden, who received folded letters in the night. The quirky tidbit: in some castles, laundry wasn't just about cleanliness, it was detective work. Love letters stuffed into sleeves, petals tucked into collars, stains of perfume or even wine on the wrong garment all became clues. Servants noticed everything, and sometimes they shared it, for amusement or for advantage. Picture a laundress holding up a tunic, raising her eyebrows knowingly, and you realise gossip could travel faster than any troubadour's song. Historians still argue about whether servants were mostly enforcers or accomplices. Did they act as informants for suspicious families, or as allies who smuggled notes and distracted chaperones? Evidence points both ways. Some servants betrayed lovers for reward or favour. Others became indispensable go-betweens, risking their positions to help romance flourish. The ambiguity itself made every relationship precarious. To trust a servant was to gamble with both your reputation and your heart. You slip deeper into the servant corridors, the air cooler, the stones worn smooth by countless feet. Here, encounters happened away from watchful eyes. Lovers could bribe a page to deliver a letter, or slip into a kitchen at night for a hurried meeting. You hear faint laughter echoing down a stairwell, followed by the soft thud of footsteps scattering. Proof that even in the shadowy underbelly of the castle, romance burned just as brightly as in the great hall, and yet the gossip carried danger. A whispered rumour could be as deadly as a duel. Entire reputations hung on the tongues of servants who passed along tales, embroidered with each retelling. Imagine being a young lady whose secret tryst becomes fodder for kitchen chatter, growing with each pass until it reaches the ears of her father or her rivals. You feel the weight of that risk pressing in these narrow halls. Still you notice how essential the servants were to love's survival. Who else could sneak a lover into a chamber, or deliver a note hidden beneath a tray of food? Who else could warn of an approaching chaperone or cover for a lady who slipped away too long? Their invisibility made them powerful, and lovers who underestimated them did so at their peril. You overhear a maid singing softly as she polishes silver. The words are harmless enough, but you catch the way she pauses meaningfully on certain phrases. You wonder if the song is really for her own amusement, or if it's a coded message for someone listening nearby. Even gossip could turn into performance, a secret slipped into rhyme. Walking back toward the main corridor, you realise another rule has become clear. Love in the Middle Ages was never just between two people. It was triangulated through a web of eyes and ears, chaperones, priests, scholars, servants. Privacy was a luxury almost no one had, and desire had to survive not in solitude but in a crowded theatre of witnesses. That makes every secret glance, every hidden letter, every stolen kiss even more extraordinary. You step out of the servant passages into the open air again. The night has deepened, the stars spread wide above the towers, and somewhere in the hush of the castle grounds, you hear another sound rising. Not gossip, not laughter, but song. Not the refined notes of troubadours, but raw, rustic voices lifted in the cool air. Beyond the castle walls, common folk are singing their own love stories, woven not in silken banners, but in simplicity. The stars shine brightly now as you step beyond the castle walls. The night air is cooler here, scented with smoke from distant cottages and the faint sweetness of wildflowers. For hours you've been immersed in the rules of noble love, ribbons, tournaments, chaperones, and codes stitched into silk. But out here, past the moat and the tilled fields, another story unfolds. It's the story of common folk who lived by simpler means but carried just as much longing. In their songs and stories you find the earthy heart of medieval romance. You pause near a fire where villagers gather, their faces ruddy in the glow. They pass around mugs of ale and raise their voices in rough but heartfelt song. The verses are bawdy, direct, full of jokes about milkmaids, shepherds, and wandering husbands. You can't help but grin. After hours of watching nobles trip over coded dances and whispered metaphors, it's refreshing to hear someone sing plainly about love, lust, and heartbreak. Mainstream historians remind us that folk songs and ballads carried on oral traditions long before and long after the polished troubadours. These songs were practical, sung at harvests, weddings, taverns, or around hearths. They told stories of betrayal, reunion, longing, or sheer silliness. They didn't need veils or hidden codes. They wore their humour and grief openly. The quirky tidbit: some of these ballads were considered so scandalous that officials tried to ban them, yet they survived, passed from mouth to mouth, sometimes recorded centuries later. Picture a town crier trying to forbid a catchy tune, only to find the entire village whistling it by sundown. Human nature hasn't changed much. We still love the songs we're not supposed to sing. Historians still argue how much overlap existed between noble, courtly love culture and peasant traditions. Did common folk really care about the ideals of restraint and poetry? Or did they stick to straightforward, earthy views of marriage and passion? Some scholars think the two worlds stayed separate, while others argue they bled into each other, influencing across class lines. Perhaps a lady in a castle window heard a field song and laughed. Perhaps a shepherd borrowed phrases from a noble's verse to woo his sweetheart. The boundaries were porous, the dialogue constant. You lean against a tree, listening to a ballad unfold. It tells the story of a ploughman who wins a lady's heart not with silk or tournaments, but with sheer persistence and humour. The refrain is catchy. The villagers laugh each time it repeats. It's not polished, but it carries truth. Out here, love doesn't need riddles or seals of wax. It survives in glances across fields, in gifts of bread or cheese, in promises whispered under hedges. The stories match the songs. Around the fire, a woman recounts a tale of two lovers who met at the midsummer fair, sneaking away during the bonfire dance. Another tells of a shepherdess who tricked her suitor with riddles before finally agreeing to marry him. These tales aren't polished epics. They're practical, sometimes comical, but always rooted in lived experience. You sense how folklore gave voice to everyday people, weaving their desires into the larger fabric of culture. You notice how rituals blend into these tales too. Bonfires, maypoles, harvest feasts, all became settings for flirtation and romance. Couples leapt flames together, wove garlands of flowers, or paired off in dances far less restrained than the ones in noble halls. If courtly love was about restraint, village love often leaned towards celebration. You can almost feel the heat of those midsummer nights, the sparks flying not just from the fires but from eager hearts. Still, dangers lingered here as well. A tryst discovered could mean scandal in a small community. A pregnancy outside marriage could bring harsh punishment. Gossip was just as sharp in villages as in castles. Yet without chaperones or court chroniclers, people found ways to bend rules with fewer theatrics. Life was shorter, harder, and sometimes that made love more urgent, less encumbered by ritual. The villagers' laughter rises again, their song blending into the crackle of the fire. You realise that while the nobles wove their romances into tapestries and tournaments, the common folk wove theirs into songs and tales. Both sought the same thing, to give shape to the inexpressible, to make longing visible, to keep desire alive in a world of hardship. As the fire burns lower and the songs fade, you step back toward the castle. The walls loom again, shadows deep along the ramparts. You've heard how the peasants sing their love into the night, but within those stone towers other voices wait. Noble women who refuse silence, who turn their longing into power, who bent the rules of a rigid world to carve out their own space in the game of desire. The castle looms above you as you re-enter its walls, but now you're led not to the great hall or the servant passages. Tonight you climb a narrow stair, spiralling into a tower chamber, reserved for women of rank. Here, tapestries line the walls, perfumed candles burn low, and a circle of noble women sit with embroidery hoops, books of poetry, or musical instruments. Their voices are soft, but their eyes are sharp. You've stepped into the world of noble women's influence, where power flows not only through kings and knights, but also through the hands of women who refuse silence. The atmosphere feels different here. While knights risk bruises on the tournament field and scholars duel with quills, these women wield subtler weapons: wit, patronage, and persuasion. They are the unseen architects of romance, bending rules to carve out spaces where desire can survive. One adjusts her gown, a movement so practiced it looks casual, but you catch the knowing glance she trades with another across the circle. Even here, the air thrums with coded communication. Mainstream historians remind us that noblewomen often held more power in courtship than is sometimes assumed. Through marriage alliances, they could elevate families, secure peace, or destabilize rivals. But beyond politics, they also shaped culture itself. Women hosted salons, sponsored troubadours, and circulated poems. They became arbiters of taste and gatekeepers of favour. In some courts, most famously in 12th century France under Eleanor of Aquitaine, women presided over so-called courts of love, mock tribunals where questions of romance were debated and judged. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some of these courts of love supposedly issued playful rulings, like whether love could exist within marriage or if jealousy improved devotion. Records suggest they treated these questions with as much seriousness as legal trials, complete with verdicts. Imagine a panel of ladies deciding that jealousy was, in fact, necessary to keep love alive, then watching nervous knights squirm under the ruling. Historians still argue whether these courts truly existed or were literary inventions, but the image itself is irresistible. And that brings us to the heart of debate. Historians can't agree on whether these noblewomen were truly empowered arbiters or whether their influence was exaggerated in poetry and legend. Some argue women like Eleanor actively shaped courtly culture. Others claim troubadours simply used the image of powerful ladies to dramatise their songs. The truth may never be clear, but sitting in this chamber, you feel the weight of their presence. These women may not swing swords, but their words, glances, and choices shape everything that happens beyond these walls. You listen as one woman plucks a lute, singing verses in Occitan. Her voice trembles at first, but soon steadies, filling the chamber with longing. Another follows with a recitation from a romance, her tone dripping with irony as she mocks a knight who mistook lust for love. The others laugh softly, but behind their mirth lies sharp judgment. These are not passive listeners. They are critics, interpreters, and creators of culture. You notice how they trade stories, some drawn from lived experience, others from myth. One recounts a tale of a cousin who outwitted her chaperones to send a token. Another describes how a rival's indiscretion brought scandal. Each story becomes both caution and inspiration. In their voices you hear both the constraints of their world and the cleverness with which they resisted them. The chamber itself reflects this power. Embroidered tapestries on the walls tell stories of heroines and saints, their stitches doubling as commentary. A cushion embroidered with a falcon might allude to loyalty or to captivity. A painted psalter open on the table contains not only scripture but marginal doodles of lovers meeting under trees. Even their domestic work becomes layered with messages, each stitch and flourish whispering resistance. And in these moments, you understand another rule. Women were never just background figures in medieval love. They were active participants, shaping, guiding, even controlling how the game was played. Their influence ran not only through dynastic politics, but also through the subtler realm of culture, where rules could be bent if not broken by sharp wit and subtle performance. The women laugh again, the sound light but edged with steel. You realise that in their hands love was never just personal pleasure. It was power, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, always shaping the world around them. You step back from the circle, leaving them to their murmured stories. Down the stair, through the dark halls, you pass the echoes of everything you've seen, ribbons tied to lances, chaperones coughing in halls, troubadours strumming riddles, priests thundering from pulpits, scholars scribbling rules, peasants singing by firelight. Together, they form a tapestry as intricate as any embroidery in that chamber, a world where love survived by bending, twisting, disguising, but never disappearing. And now, as the last candle burns low and the castle falls into silence, you feel the story itself fading, like torchlight guttering against the dawn. Now the pace slows, the castle grows still, its stone corridors cooling, its torches snuffed one by one. You let the noise of laughter and debate fade, the songs and whispers dissolving into soft echoes. Imagine the banners in the great hall drooping into shadow, the ribbons on knights' arms fluttering once before settling into stillness. The entire fortress exhales, as though centuries of longing finally sigh themselves to rest. You breathe deeply, letting your body soften with the rhythm. The urgency of tournaments, the secrecy of letters, the sharp wit of noble women, all of it drifts into the background now, like dust settling on quiet stone. What remains is only the essence, that people longed, struggled, risked, and dreamed just as they do now. Love was never tidy, never safe, but it endured. Picture yourself walking once more through the empty courtyard. The fountain trickles faintly, the stars hang heavy above, and the walls no longer press in with rules. You're free to let the images fade, the ribbons, the masks, the firelight, like lanterns floating into the night sky. With every breath they drift farther until only calm remains. So let your eyes close. Let the story slip from castle to dream. Feel the quiet hum of history settle around you like a blanket, reassuring and warm. And know that even across centuries, love still hums at the heart of every whispered word, every stitched flower, every lingering glance. Now rest, letting silence carry you into sleep. Sweet dreams.